Here we go. I will call the meeting back to order. And again, for those of you who have joined us this afternoon, the Arctic Research Commission had a robust discussion this morning on both infrastructure and on health and cultural research. And our pattern here is for the presenters to do their presentations and to have the question and answer period at the end of those presentations. I will lead off this afternoon very briefly with a few comments about the workshop which was recently held by Lieutenant Governor Byron Malott on the topic of climate change and adaptation. And just very briefly, we were invited to come and spend a few hours discussing the extent to which the state of Alaska could take some affirmative action in not only dealing with the rapid rate of climate change and the impacts from that change in Alaska, but also do innovative things that would make our communities more livable and more resilient. The way the meeting was structured was to basically have a few overview comments, first by Byron Malott, and then by a few others, and then we broke up into small groups and brainstormed. And the groups were on the following topics: mitigation, adaptation, research, response, and communication. And some people were invited to spend 15, 20, 25 minutes, whatever, at each of those and rotate, or if they wanted to just stay at one for the entire time. And the idea really was not to come up with a short list, but rather to just throw all the ideas on the table of what it is that the state of Alaska could do that might be productive and might be helpful, both from the standpoint of mitigating climate change and adapting to climate change, and bringing the innovation that research and cooperation can bring to a problem, to take that to a level that would be useful in the short, medium, and long term. As many of you probably know, the state of Alaska did have a climate change task force back in around 2006, 2007. It had both a mitigation and an adaptation team. They made a number of recommendations. The report came out under Governor Sarah Palin, and we all agreed that many of the recommendations that were made by that effort remained current today as things that we could build on. And so the idea was, yes, we take a look at not only the list of things that were recommended by that earlier task force, but also suggestions that were made by the participants in an online survey that was done before we met that morning. So we literally got lists under each of those topics. So when we sat around in the small groups, we had a list to start with and then either comment on or expand on or add to. So it was a pretty productive way to spend 2.5 hours. At the end, the conclusion was basically the state, the governor and the lieutenant governor and the cabinet will take under advisement all of that brainstorming and try to evolve a concrete plan of some specific things that the state of Alaska can do that would be useful and timely. There wasn't really any clear indication of exactly when that would happen or what the format would be or how we would hear back, so it wasn't that specific. But I would just note that Lieutenant Governor Byron Malott did a beautiful job both at the beginning and at the end of explaining how important this was to the people of Alaska and to future generations, that we really focus attention in this area. He also did an excellent job of reminding us that unless we fix our fiscal problems, it will be pretty hard to achieve anything in any direction on any topic, and did a very impassioned call out to everyone in that room. And the room was, business leaders, community leaders, research scientists, all kinds of people. a call out to everyone in the room to please focus some attention over the next few weeks and months on talking to legislators, so that going into the special session, we might actually get some action as opposed to just non-action, which is what the past couple of special sessions have resulted in. At any rate, it was a good morning, and I think that probably sums up my comments, so I'll pass the mic back to Cheryl to introduce the rest of the panel. I would be happy to answer questions later, but as I said, I think the good news here is that both the governor and the lieutenant governor are focused, and they want to do something useful and are still in the mode of listening to people. So if folks have good ideas about very specific things that Alaska can do in this space, I think the door is still open.
Thanks, Fran. Okay, so this is our environmental, we ended up calling it environmental science session. We've got 3 more speakers. The next speaker is John Pearce, and he is the, I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget it. Okay. Supervisory wildlife biologist with the USGS Alaska Science Center, and he's going to speak to us about USGS environmental programs that have to do with the Arctic. And I have a handout for you guys that we'll go over later in our closed session that has some of the information that you're probably going to talk to us about. I have your one-pager, the USGS one-pager for Arctic Science Strategy.
Okay. All right, thanks very much.
Yep, hang on one second.
Okay. So first, let me just thank the Commission for inviting me to speak today. I really appreciate it. And what I'd like to do is give you an overview of some of the Arctic science that USGS nationwide is involved in, specifically targeted at the goals and the objectives document provided by the USARC Research Commission.
Do you have the clicker up there? Okay, excellent.
I do, for 2017 and 2018. But first, I just want to touch on the USGS research role in Arctic issues for those of you that may not be aware of USGS research and the mission of our agency. So we're the science research agency for the Department of the Interior. We have no regulatory mandate. We don't manage resources. We don't manage lands. We just provide sound, relevant, and impartial science information to federal agencies for their management decisions. And we also make this available to the public and other partners. As a result of that role, we play a large research role in the state of Alaska because 60% of the land here is managed by federal entities, and those have trust responsibilities that we focus our research on. For example, Fish and Wildlife Service oversees the management of migratory birds. They also oversee management of some of the marine mammals, as well as BOEM. And there's also numerous land and resource management questions that are addressed by BLM, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and BOEM. So we focus our research on these, with these partners and on their decision-making needs. So what I've done through the rest of the talk is to have the title be about the goals that are in your objectives document, and the italics in the top part of the slide come from the recommendations that are in the pages of that document, and how USGS science has either addressed, I feel like, some of these objectives and recommendations, or is currently addressing those. So to start off with, the impact of Arctic sea ice loss to species distributions in particular, I would say this is one of the main focal areas of the USGS Alaska Science Center here in Anchorage. We recently released a number of studies for the Fish and Wildlife to use in the decision-making for the ESA decision for walrus. That included this report on walrus haul-out distributions throughout the Bering and the Chukchi Sea. And we're also doing continuous work on polar bears, mostly currently focused on the conservation plan that was drafted by Fish and Wildlife Service, but also this paper that we released in 2014 that's called Evaluating and Ranking Threats to the Long-Term Persistence of Polar Bears. So a lot of that is driven by sea ice loss, and future research will continue to address that. How this same recommendation applies to community vulnerability to coastal erosion. USGS Coastal Marine Geology program based in Santa Cruz recently released this report that looked at shoreline's change rates across the North Slope of Alaska. And not only did they look at this broad perspective, but they also have maps in this document that are very specific to communities, very specific to specific shorelines across the North Slope. And phase 2 of this work will actually move down the western coast of Alaska, working with state and other federal partners. Again, in relation to sort of how both these two recommendations come together, the species distributions and community vulnerability to erosion, not only the human communities, but also ecological communities. So work with the USGS and Fish and Wildlife have identified that as a result of sea ice decline, we've seen flooded coastal tundra across the North Slope, but largely around near the Drew Point, Cape Halkett area. So in this area, we've identified the very fastest rates of shoreline change, and we're seeing large increases in snow goose, black brant, and white-fronted goose colonies there in response to this change, because the flooded coastal tundra has habitats that's highly nutritious to those goose species. So as far as a recommendation for understanding trends in glacial and ice sheet extent, USGS has a large program called Ice Field to Oceans, led by Shad O'Neill and the Alaska Science Center. This is a poster from a recent publication in Bioscience, where they quantify that nearly half of the freshwater discharge into the Gulf of Alaska originates as glacier runoff. This has implications for a wide variety of ecosystem components. This is a paper that Yumi Armitsu led, looking at zooplankton, phytoplankton, a number of fish and bird species, and how climate-driven changes in that freshwater runoff may alter food web dynamics going forward. And so these are just isotopic values for how those different communities utilize, whether it's coastal runoff, freshwater runoff, or offshore components. We've also looked at snow cover, not necessarily snow cover loss, but actually snow cover gain. So this is up on the North Slope, some modeling that Ben Jones and colleagues did, looking at the decline in sea ice and the ocean warming effect as a result of that. So that's a model in the top part just showing different strata of warming on the North Slope. They also were able to model the increase of snow as a result of that warmer temperatures and greater temperature or greater moisture in the air, and actually find places where there's going to be potentially more snow in the future, and then how this relates to the thinning of lake ice across the North Slope. And then one of their conclusions is that reductions in sea ice extent will alter temperature, precipitation, lake ice thickness, and habitat functioning of Arctic lakes. We have also done a lot of work on yellow-billed loons in this area, and also work on connected and disconnected water bodies across the North Slope. And so Ben's zone directly influences how we understand yellow-billed loon habitat use and the fish that they rely on. So as lakes potentially become more disconnected or more connected, we expect to see changes in fish diversity across the landscape. In terms of recommendation on mapping distribution of permafrost, this was a collaborative effort with USGS participation in 2015, that mapped permafrost across the state. And that report projected that near surface permafrost that presently underlies 38% of the boreal in Arctic Alaska will be reduced by 16 to 24% by the end of the 21st century if these modeling efforts are accurate, and that permafrost declines are more likely in central than in northern Alaska. Furthermore, in terms of mapping distribution of permafrost, Ben Jones and some colleagues also mapped the surficial geology of the North Slope, particularly around the NPRB region, for where there's thermokarst deposits underneath this landscape. And mostly what they were trying to identify is terrain that we be most particularly susceptible to thaw. And this is informative for communities, but also for industry. And one particular type that they found, which was most susceptible, is this marine silt, which is the dark green area. So this area up through to Barrow. So an area that's of current great interest for oil and gas development. As far as changes in ocean temperature, we have 2 projects working on coastal marine fishes. One that's ongoing, led by Vanessa Von Biela, that's looking at changes in community structure of a variety of marine fish, some that are important to all kinds of marine birds and other species, but also to humans as well. And then a BOEM report that's just about complete in our office, looking at the genomics of Arctic cod across the Beaufort and Chukchi seas to understand if there are distinct populations of this species. Additionally, we've been looking a lot at the blob and warming ocean temperatures and how this may influence both marine fish and seabirds. We've added new capabilities to our lab to actually test a wide variety of tissues for algal toxins. Doing this in collaboration with NOAA and Fish and Wildlife Service. So this is a new capability that we've added to our lab here in Anchorage. There's a recommendation under Goal 1 in terms of understanding more about the Arctic boreal forest. In a paper that the Alaska Science Center released last year, we looked at a long-term data set for waterfowl populations in relationship to fires in the western boreal forest. And that found that there were, so this is related to another study. So this study that Lewis et al. Found that the waterfowl populations were largely resilient to those wildfires. across the Western Boreal. We've also in the past done work on the positive and negative responses of birds and plants to spruce bark beetle infestation. So that's something that we have a history in that we could do more of in the future. In terms of goal 2 of improving Arctic health, this is another focal point of Alaska Science Center work, understanding not only local pathogen pathways, but international pathogen pathways. So currently we're doing work on the Kenai River and elsewhere throughout the state at landfills to understand the movement of antimicrobial resistant bacteria by gulls that could interact with humans, such as at the Kenai mouth where folks are harvesting salmon. And then we have a long history of studying avian influenza and other pathogens that move through migratory birds across these international pathways. We also have a current study understanding just some basic baseline levels of wildlife disease across the Arctic. One of those pictured here is Toxoplasma gondii. It's a common human parasite, and the definitive host is cats. We found prevalence of this in Arctic foxes, polar bears, and marine mammals, but not in caribou, migratory birds, or small mammals. So we have some information on pathways, and now we're trying to determine the mechanisms of those, because migratory birds were thought to be a possible mechanism of moving these to the Arctic. Another place that we spend a lot of time is on the distribution and migratory pathways of wildlife to inform management. This is just an example of work that was published in 2014 that has documented the spread of black brant out of the TLSA into other coastal areas as a result of these new habitats being created that I mentioned earlier in the talk. So that's an ongoing process. And then we're also working with the Fish and Wildlife Service in that lower figure to take their 26-year data set and partition that out to really understand where the changes in distribution and abundance are taking place across the North Slope, not just in general trend numbers. We also have a new caribou biologist in our office who is working to carry on the work of Dave Gustine. But this year, Dave Gustine also released a paper that looked at the trophic phenological mismatch with caribou across the wide sort of north to south transect from the Brooks Range up to the coast. And in that study, he found no evidence for a mismatch between the plant green-up and important caribou life stages, comparing it to a study that was done by Fish and Game about 40 years ago. Under goal 4, in terms of advancing the Arctic built environment, we're doing work here as well. Ben Jones has released a geospatial database of over 4,000 lakes in the NPRA and the Fish Creek drainage for resource use planning, and every single one of these lakes is categorized in a variety of different ways that would be useful for resource use planning up there. And also this year, we also released a study that looked at disturbance metrics for Arctic nesting geese in response to not only industry, but to the direct disturbance of people walking around the tundra. There's also a paper in press right now looking at scenario planning for polar bears in relation to human polar bear conflicts. So whether or not communities should maintain bone piles near their communities or pull those away from town to reduce the number of conflicts with people. And then our new caribou biologist, Heather Johnson, is currently working on a project to understand the habituation of Central Arctic caribou to the infrastructure within Prudhoe Bay. Under goal 5, I don't think we have any specific projects to relate to these recommendations, but I did just want to add that we're doing a lot of outreach and communication. We're always looking for better ways to improve communicating our work with communities near where we work and get their feedback. So I'm always open to new ideas about how to do that in appropriate and effective ways. Oh, and I should mention that second bullet in terms of inclusive approaches to Arctic research, part of a group that Cheryl's also on that's addressing the principles of Arctic research and revising that document. So we're part of that as well. And then lastly, your document ends with a set of emerging topics, and I just wanted to touch on a few of those. Habitat shifts, as I mentioned earlier, is a major focal point for our research. I've already talked about polar bears, Pacific walrus, and migratory waterfowl as research that we've done and are continuing to do. Another one of those is land birds. This is a publication that came out last year looking at land bird responses to increasing shrub height and density on the Seward Peninsula. And basically, this map just shows you that there's a lot of different responses. It's not all the same. Every species has a different response. Some are positive, some are negative, and some are up and down. So this gives us some ideas of what we could expect in the future in places like the Seward Peninsula for the distribution and abundance of different land bird species. We've also done work on small mammals. Andrew Hope with our center and 2 years ago published this effort where he modeled the projections for 28 small mammal species across the state And the amazing thing about this is that small mammals are not migratory. So this actually gives us an idea of what habitat is going to look like in the state going forward. So these are modeled out to the 2050s based on genetic evidence and some bioclimatic modeling. And then lastly, in terms of carbon sequestration, this was a report that Dave McGuire with USGS co-op unit Fairbanks and co-authors released in 2016 that provides some projections of carbon sequestration and carbon release across the state. And then I think you all also asked sort of what we might identify as emerging topics. And the one that I came up with was just basically integrating all this information. We provide ourselves all kinds of disparate data on all kinds of things. As I put this talk together, I realized there's a lot of opportunity for us to integrate within our own science center. So that's a priority that I think I'll place on myself and our people going forward in the future to pull all this information together. And in 2015, a number of folks at USGS authored a report with Caroline Van Hemert at the lead in bioscience to come up with sort of an Arctic-wide response model that demonstrates sort of how we're putting our research together, well, where we'd like to ultimately to go, and that's at the top of just focal species responses. How are they responding to all these different mechanisms of change that we're observing, and how can we provide that best to managers? So that's all I have, and I really appreciate the time to present to you today, and I'd be happy to take questions at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, great. Thank you, John. So next up, we have Betsy Baker, the Executive Director of the North Pacific Research Board, and she's going to talk to us about the NPRB's Arctic Integrated Ecosystem Research Program.
Yes. So thank you to the Commission and the chance to see some familiar faces and speak to some new ones. I would refer you to the biennial report for the NPRB, and the two flyers that I inserted in that will provide background on two of the cruises that are the first in NPRB's Arctic Integrated Ecosystem Research Program. The first field season literally just wrapped up, and we have a logistics meeting going on over in our offices, which is why the program manager, Danielle Dixon, is not here to speak with you, but I am eager to have the chance to do so. So I wanted to provide a brief overview of NPRB for those of you not familiar with us. Unlike the program that John just presented, we do have a very specific legislative mandate. We were created by Congress in 1997 to pursue collaborative research on pressing fishery management issues and ecosystem information needs. And we operate in the 3 large marine ecosystems around the state of Alaska. The membership of the board is also legislatively mandated. The U.S. Arctic Research Commission is represented, and Dave Benton currently does that service for the commission. A number of other federal agencies, Alaska Fish and Game, and Washington and Oregon, as well as Alaska, has seats, as does the Sea Life Center, a range of organizations. But the Alaska representation, I think, is important. There is a fisheries seat, an Alaska Native Interest seat, oil and gas, conservation, environmental, and an academic seat. And that does play a role in some of the communications activity that I'll be talking about. So there is that 20-member board. We have an advisory panel of representatives from around the state, and we have a science panel that both play a very key role in providing community input to the request for proposals for the science that we seek from the community. So since the organization began funding science in 2002, we reached the $100 million mark last year and are now at $106 million. We have 4 main program areas. I'll be focusing on the one in the center, but wanted to spend a few words on the core program because we have Arctic-related research there as well. And just to mention that every year the board funds up to 6 graduate students at $25,000 to apply to their master's or PhD work. And the board has committed to a $2 million commitment to long-term monitoring over 5 years. And those are also smaller but important pieces of what the board funds. Briefly on the core program, you can see some of the statistics there in the amount of monies that we have traditionally funded. Due to market shifts that may drop some, and the board is in the process of balancing between the core program and the integrated programs. But at any given time, we have about 90 active projects, and the professional staff of PhD scientists helps to manage those. And we also have an emphasis on communication and outreach. I will simply leave that link there for those of you who want to know more, but there's quite a bit about, we offer many tools on our website, especially for communicating science to Alaska Native communities and to the broader public. And that is, in my view, responsive to one of the goals that John also just mentioned that the Commission has highlighted, and that of integrating approaches as well as communicating the science. So that's all very brief. I will mention 2 Arctic specific projects that the board just funded in the last round of the core program. One is to improve the collars, the tagging collars for polar bears. And some of what we do is leverage other resources. So USGS has also contributed quite a bit to that project. And then another is a social science study on improving the effectiveness of the marine mammal commissions. And I'm happy to provide detail on any of those. But to the subject at hand, which is the Arctic Integrated Ecosystem Research Program. It's the 3rd that NPRB has funded. The first on the Bering Sea has concluded. The second on the Gulf of Alaska is currently in its synthesis phase. And as mentioned, we have just launched the first 2 cruises of the 5-year program that is the Arctic Integrated Ecosystem Research Program. And it is important to mention the funding partners, BOEM and the Collaborative Alaskan Arctic Studies Program, which you may know as the North Slope Burrow Shell Baseline Studies Program, since renamed. ONR has also provided funding and a lot of in-kind support, especially from NOAA and UAF. And that's a repeated theme, is seeking partners working whether through the core or integrated program to leverage resources. So the overarching question seems to me also to be very directly responsive to one of the Commission's goals, which is to talk about the effects of the loss of sea ice. And I should note that the Commission and IARPC were also very, very helpful in shaping the overall structure of the program and the questions that the 27 PIs are answering. But how will reductions in Arctic sea ice and the associated physical changes in the physical environment influence the flow of energy, basically through the food web, through the ecosystem in the Chukchi Sea? So with 27 PIs, they will be approaching that question from many different disciplines. And I'm going to talk a bit about what NPRB provides in terms of a structure for that integration. John identified integrating a lot of different information as one of the emerging research areas, and we see that as something that we're very actively trying to facilitate. So we do have a program manager who does things such, this is Danielle Dixon, who is currently in a logistics planning meeting because we're at the end of the cruise season. And they're not only doing a post-mortem, but previewing for the next cruise seasons. How can they better coordinate information? There are annual PI meetings and there are monthly webinars. I've never heard a webinar described as the place where the magic happens, but that's how Danielle describes the energy on those phone calls as the PIs get to know each other and get to know each other's work. I can provide a lot more detail on the type of infrastructure that NPRB provides, but that infrastructure is also, it costs. So the travel to do things like communicate with the communities, the travel to the annual PI meetings, those are all part of the project. I refer you to our blog, which you have the URL for there, and our communications and outreach director was on the first cruise this summer on the Sikuliak, and all of the scientists contributed, describing their science in layman's terms, I think very, very effectively. But some of the substantive questions that we are funding, if you will, to answer that overarching question of what is the flow of energy, how is that being affected through the Chukchi ecosystem? So some are looking at the transport, seasonal composition, distribution, and production of phytoplankton, particulate matter, zooplankton, fishes, benthic invertebrates, seabirds, and marine mammals. Others are looking at the timing, magnitude, and fate of primary and secondary productivity. Others are looking at the density and distribution of marine mammals and seabirds. We have a social science component looking at the human dimensions of change in some coastal communities in the Chukchi. So I will just talk briefly about the 2 cruises that have just wrapped up. And the first is led by Seth Danielson of the University of Alaska Fairbanks on the Sikuliaq. And this is late spring this year, and then again next year that the Sikuliaq will be going out. And they're looking at the Asgard, the shelf growth, advection, respiration, and deposition rate measurements. There's a lot of physical, chemical, and biological oceanography going on, and some fish sampling. The second cruise I'll talk about is focused more on fish. And you do have the pink sheet that you have. There's one for the spring cruise, and there's one for the summer cruise that provides a lot more detail. This gives you a sense of the number of people involved and the number of institutions. We had a coastal community observer, Opika Kinga from Little Diomede was along, as well as 8 graduate students. Some of the basic information that Seth is just very, very excited about is they landed smack dab in the middle of the spring bloom. This is a time of year that we have typically not been able to sample. And so for the vessel to be out there and to be measuring live, if you will, was very exciting for the crew. Modeling will also be supported by the data that is collected has been collected on this cruise and next summer. This is just one set of statistics that shows how many miles, how many bird surveys, marine mammal surveys. The statistic that does not show up there is the 45 hours that they suspended operations to join a search and rescue for that skiff that was lost off of Wales. And that was something that the vessel actually stayed out longer than they'd originally planned because they very much wanted to be involved in that. So other things unexpected do come up that support the overall mission of understanding what's going on in the Arctic. The second cruise just wrapped up last week. Ed Farley led Ed Farley of the Alaska Fisheries Science Center led one of the first legs. And I should note that the map that you have here and on your handout has actually been adjusted based on feedback that we received from meetings with the communities saying, no, that's too late. We want you out of there earlier, and we want you to adjust some of the track lines. And so that's one of the things that we set out to do with our whole communication structure, is to make sure that we were not interfering with subsistence, and that was a concrete result of that. I call it the fish and food web cruise. I know that Ed probably wouldn't characterize it quite like that, but for the broader audience, they really are taking, the primary focus is understanding the movement of fish northward or not, the distribution and abundance also of seabirds and marine mammals, all dependent upon the food chain that they're also studying. And there'll be a second cruise, not next summer, but the summer after. The cruise just ended. We do not yet have photographs. We do not yet have a cruise report, but this gives you a sense of the range of institutions involved. And I should note that on the Arctic website, the NPRB Arctic Program website, you will find the cruise report from the first cruise, as well as the community observer report. And I'm happy to provide those directly if you would like that. So one set of hypotheses that the fish and food web cruise is working on is, their hypotheses are that the number of Arctic cod will likely decline over the long term, that they might increase initially, but decline over about a 50-year time frame. Saffron cod will likely increase. Snow crab and Pacific herring will likely stay the same, more or less, but these are hypotheses. So based on not just the trawl results, but the oceanographic information on temperature and other characteristics, they'll put all of this together to try to test those hypotheses. Also part of the program are 2 moorings in the Bering Strait and the southern Chukchi to record year-round marine mammal and vessel noise. And then a social science team project is, I've mentioned already, understanding and responses to environmental change in a select number of communities. And there are 4 co-PIs on this: Julie Raymond Jacobian from Kawarak, Noah Naylor from the Northwest Arctic Borough, Kayan Harcharik from the North Slope Borough, and Henry Huntington are the 4 PIs. And they are working together with 9 tribally nominated representatives from those communities to identify whether it's economic or environmental drivers that are the primary response, or driving the way that they are experiencing change in those communities. And I should note that those PIs and community members are also attending the annual principal investigators meeting. So members from the communities are sitting down at the table with the natural scientists to refine the hypotheses and to revise the questions being asked. So this is an initial effort on the part of NPRB to address, again, the Commission's goal of integrating approaches to research from different traditions. And on that, I just wanted to highlight a few other ways that NPRB has been attempting to integrate approaches from the natural sciences and from the traditional knowledge worlds. The Pacific Marine Synthesis in 2013 has a very long list of questions generated from 3 hub meetings in communities from around the study area, and I can provide that as well. So that helped identify topics for the IRP itself. And then with the beginning of the Arctic Integrated Program, we've held hub meetings in Nome, Kotzebue, and Barrow, where tribally nominated representatives came and expressed questions, concerns, need to shift crews based on potential subsistence conflicts. We'll be returning to those communities. We've been making presentations to the Arctic Waterways Safety Committee and as many of the marine mammal co-management organizations as will have us. Community observers, I've already talked about the Coastal Communities Study, and we have ANSEP student involvement. So that's all prior to the cruises taking place, and follow-up meetings, hopefully with that same group of tribally nominated representatives on a regular basis to keep each other apprised. And then during the cruise, working with those hub meetings, we came up with a standard protocol for operational communication. So written notifications to all of the tribal councils prior to the cruise start, and then daily communications from the vessels. I've talked about changing the tracks in response to subsistence concerns. Independent of those 27 PIs, we also have 22 collaborating partners who are largely federally funded agencies that are contributing. Some of those projects, just to give you a sense of who they are, there's the Northern Bering Sea Bottom Trawl Survey that's funded by NOAA. There is acoustic oceanography and zooplankton study, funding provided by BOEM, and a range of other projects who are not gaining any funding from NPRB, but they are gaining access to collaborative opportunities, to data sharing, and to the chance to work together to refine their own projects as they go forward. So I will wrap up. These are notes from Seth's cruise report talking about the process rate measurements, but I think they apply well also to the other crews, the fish crews, that there is an economy of scale with the integrated ecosystem research projects. And I would echo John's comment as well, that we view this as an emerging area that we're trying to understand better. And some of the projects that he mentioned, I could see some overlap with some of the work being done on these cruises as well. The collaboration opportunities do spawn highly leveraged, value-added data integrations. So with that, I'll thank you and look forward to answering your questions when we have the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Bessie. All right, great. So our final speaker in this session is Melanie Smith. She is the Director of Conservation with the Alaska Audubon Society. and they just had a recent rollout of their Ecological Atlas of the Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort Seas. And I will put up your presentation. And we also have these wonderful posters that she's put up on the wall, as well as 2 of the atlases and one out front as well, that they were kind enough to donate to the Arctic Research Commission for folks to look through. And yeah, so hopefully on break, folks can get a chance to take a look at what's up on the walls. Yeah.
And if you prefer the tiny version to the 4-pound version, I sat a thumb drive at each of your seats there. So.
All right.
Okay, well, so I'm here to talk to you about our project for building better marine maps. And we had a large effort to synthesize Arctic science to build this ecological atlas. So within Audubon, this is a project that spans 10 years. The first edition of this atlas we put out in 2010. And the second edition took us 2 years, from mid-2015 through August of this year. So what is an ecological atlas? Well, it's a way of layering information together, and then this stack of maps represents an ecosystem. And you can look at patterns and connections among those different topics and species and uses. So I'm going to show you what's inside the atlas, the process that we use, and then how does it relate to USARC goals. So the maps are all split into 6 different thematic chapters. The first chapter is the physical setting, and that's where we look at ocean currents and sea ice and different climate factors and climate change projections. Next is the biological setting with primary productivity, zooplankton, and benthic fauna, followed by fishes, birds, which is a really big, thick chapter in there, and mammals, so polar bears, walrus, ice seals, and whales. And then human uses is the last of those 6 thematic chapters, where we look at vessel traffic patterns, subsistence use, infrastructure, energy development, and so on. So in each of those chapters, we present the best available data. That included science data. It also included an indigenous knowledge data set from the Queric region. So we were focused on acquiring sets of data and making an even bigger set of data and synthesizing that all together. And Queric has done a really nice job with mapping walrus and ice seal use patterns, and we worked with them to include that here. So in each of those previous chapters, we've mapped the best available data, we've described patterns, data sources, methods, and conservation issues as taken from literature and reports. And then it's the last chapter, the last few pages, where we give the Audubon Alaska perspective on what we learned doing this work. We reserve that for a separate chapter, and we present 9 conservation and management themes in that chapter. There are a few other things in the atlas that we put in. We have these sections called A Closer Look, where we take an in-depth, little bit more in-depth on some special topics. Like this is a comparison of vessel traffic between Unimak Pass and Bering Strait. And then we describe natural history and lay in a lot of beautiful photos to give people a better sense of what this place is and what it's like to be there. So part 2 is how we made the atlas. So we have a process that we call data to design, and it consists of first gathering data, then synthesizing it, and then using it to design maps or conservation plans, and so on. So we begin by identifying what type of data are available. Those could be colony census counts. They could be at-sea surveys or aerial surveys, telemetry from GPS or geolocators, indigenous knowledge, personal communication with experts, and so on. So then we acquire that data. That's another very lengthy process. I feel like many of the slides here could be a whole talk, because A lot of people worked on this, and some of these slides, this one represents one person's job for 2 years. And it's just, I'm just going to say a few words about it. But so taking data from disparate data sets that are stored in many different formats and all have different attributes and metadata, and bringing it into one uniform database is a big job. So some of the data come just how we need them, and then others are come like this. And so actually they don't come like this. They come in maybe 30 or 40 different databases that we put together into this one that has almost 2 million points in it of bird survey locations throughout Alaska. And so the orange points would be where king eiders are located, and then skip a bunch of important steps, and you can see where we've narrowed this down to map concentration and regular use for breeding king eiders in Alaska and Canada. And then that gets put into this bigger map. So the yellow you just saw is the same yellow in this box here, and then we need to match that with the same on the Russian side for breeding. And then we need to find the same type of data for where they're wintering and molting, staging and migrating and so on. So that's this step called compositing, and that's where we have a number of different studies that happened at different times and used different methods. And some of them overlap and may or may not agree on the exact results they found, and we have to think really hard about the best practices for integrating all these different types of data and how you prioritize which data sets you use and how you blend ones that are different. So once you have your data identified and acquired and organized and analyzed and composited, then there's a step of design. And so something I think that can be commonly overlooked is just how much time it takes to design something then that's useful. Because if we didn't do this part, this is what the maps would look like. And so what you get when you throw data into ArcGIS and what you get when you have a professional cartographer full-time for 2 years are two really different products. And so we had hours and hours and hours of conversations to redesign this king eider map over and over and over again as we found new data and changed the colors and the styles, and as we made it all colorblind tested and found better ways to represent migration and found out where their wintering areas are and what they do when they're in Russia and so on over the course of a couple of years. So that's just one of about, I don't know, maybe 100 maps. And so then you end up with this, ta-da, the final baked product here. And so this is where the work in a lot of ways really begins, because now we have this synthesis complete and it's out into the world. We just printed it in August. And depending on what it is that you work on, I think there's probably something in here that may interest you. And so you can start looking at sea ice patterns and climate change and where ice seals are concentrating and how fisheries are managed, and ask yourself some important questions. And use this for uses from oil spill response planning to energy development, siting, to vessel traffic routing. So part 3 is how this relates to the goals of the commission. And under your first goal, well, this is a way of communicating what is known. And there's a whole lot of kind of mapping magic that goes into showing what we know. This doesn't show you what we don't know. And then for some of the data behind this, you can actually look at trends and change, like the bird surveys that have been happening for a few decades, or aerial surveys of marine mammals in the Arctic Ocean, or sea ice recorded by satellites. And those are, we have maps that represent those very large databases that are stewarded by other agencies like USGS, Fish and Wildlife, BOEM, and NOAA, and so on. there are a lot of other data that there just isn't enough data to really look at trends over time. It takes decades of single sampling points to pull together one seamless map of zooplankton, for example. So you may be able to do that in certain selected areas that have been studied through time, but to do it across the 3 Cs, there are limited opportunities to look at trends. So there are also some ways to look forward, and the NOAA's climate models for the Bering Sea are a huge effort that we've recently used to assess climate vulnerability for seabirds with the Bering Sea LCC. So related to your first goal, I saw that you have this objective to bring new resources to the study of the boreal forest, and we've also identified that as a priority. We want to produce an ecological atlas like this for the boreal forest, so I wanted to let you know that, and that we're seeking funding to do that. So any ideas are welcome on how we may be able to find the funds to do that project. And I want to mention database and attribute standardization. So we have a system that we've set up that works to pull all these different types of data into and crosswalk them and make them all work together. And we'd be really happy to share that among the larger science community and start thinking about whether we can all be using similar standards or even the same template for how we store our data. Related to goal 5, this I really don't consider my area of expertise. However, we did, give our good best try at integrating indigenous knowledge with the science, and found that it worked well and was very useful information that should be considered more in these types of processes. In this case, it was focused on the Coeric region because that's where they had an existing database that was reviewed, and we worked with their tribal leads from the 9 communities that participated in that to review our maps in the atlas. And we included subsistence data where we were able to acquire it. There are IK and subsistence data sets out there that we were not able to acquire. We included what we could. And so a recommendation is that, well, like I said, we found that very useful. And if the other communities are interested that haven't done something similar to what Coeric has done, I just want to put out support for that kind of indigenous-led spatial data collection effort. And then last is your goal for enhancing international cooperation. When we're doing transboundary mapping, you, even though you may be looking just across the boundary line, you might have to contact someone in Moscow or St. Petersburg or Ottawa to find the data that you need. So it's very disconnected. A lot of times it just seems like a big black box or blank place on the map. And I just think there's a whole lot we could be doing there to better connect with people on the other side of the border to even know what research is happening, what's going on. I'm certain we've missed things in that process. And then also to plant this idea for assessing and managing species based on their whole life history. I was surprised to learn, pick a sea duck and look over in Russia and learn just how much is going on over there. We often, sometimes the maps don't even show Russia at all. It just looks like it's ocean. It's just a lot gets left out. And once we start looking at species distributions holistically, we can think about our stewardship responsibility for them. For some species that just visit here for part of the year, like a gray whale or something that lives within Alaska its entire life, like a whiskered auklet, and think about how you might manage those differently. And finally, this happens with the help of lots and lots of people over a long time. So Oceana and Daniel Huffman, the cartographer, were our 2 primary collaborators on the project. And then we had assistance from Coeric, And Alaska Ocean Observing System hosts all of the data. Once this is done, they're in the process of putting that on their portal right now. Fish and Wildlife and USGS were very generous in sharing data and staff time and review. BOEM, Alaska region, reviewed every map and description in the atlas for us, and so on. And it was all funded by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Melanie. That was great. And thanks to all the speakers. I'm going to open it up to questions now. Do any of the commissioners have questions for the speakers?
That is me for Melanie.
And if panelists want to come up front, just I need you to use the
Just where you wanted to go, right?
Sorry.
It's a real simple question. You touched on it right there at the end, and I was curious, what kind of peer review process do you have on how you interpreted other folks' data? How rigorous was that review process?
Yeah, the peer review process was, it took place throughout the whole length of time. So first we're contacting researchers to find out what data are out there, what ones they recommend are the best data. And then in some cases, we're working with them actively to develop the maps, like say Tim Bowman at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we met with time and again to get the sea duck maps right, and that's one example. Once the maps are created and all the descriptions are written, then every one of them goes to at least one expert on that topic. And so some of them go to multiple people, but they all go to at least one expert. Then the whole chapters themselves were also reviewed. So certain key people received an entire chapter to tell us if we've missed something big. And those would tend to be people like John Pearce or Eric Taylor or Kathy Kuhn. And in the case of Kathy, she said, we'll be happy to review the entire thing and split it up among all of her staff at BOEM. And then there was the tribal review of the Bering Strait region that I had mentioned. So in total, we had about 85 different reviewers work on it.
Also for Melanie, thank you. This is really quite a marvelous product, and thank you for this.
Yeah.
Amazingly portable. So mapping magic, and thanks for your discussion on that. It's clear that the person who was responsible for a particular distribution of the eider, let's say, has an insight into the nature of those data the way probably no one else does at this point. So you mentioned, for example, with some species, you might have to look at 2 decades of distribution data to put together one map. And clearly, there are the problems of aliasing with time, and you can't really say definitively how much changed over time. In other cases, you may have the data that allows you to see that. To what degree does that kind of insight, and again, I'm pointing to the individuals who have this in their head now, to what degree is that insight as to what was found and whether there's some hints of things changing or not contained in the report? Is there a synopsis of sort of the magic mapper's view of wow, there's an interesting question here, or this data set is really problematic because I did have to put together 2 decades of data to say. So that kind of interpretive insight, I mean, clearly someone looking at it from a distance who doesn't know anything about the distribution of that species would not be able to guess any of that. To what degree is that drawn out and might be the subject of further research for people who use the Atlas?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's in there partially, but not completely. Each map has a data mapping methods description. And so it'll tell you what it's based on. In some cases, we're just like literally picking up a report and georeferencing and digitizing a boundary they drew. So if you want to know about that boundary, then you need to go back to their report and see how they did it and why they drew it that way. But in other cases, we're taking, the raw survey data and we're analyzing it ourselves. So we've described that in the data mapping methods. Places where we looked at change that is specifically reported in the atlas are for sea ice margins and climate projections. So someone has asked me the question in the past of whether you can look at the first edition of the atlas and the second edition and compare them, and that represents change. And the answer to that is definitely no. It really represents a maturing of spatial data in the scientific community. And as I've gone to the Alaska Marine Science Symposium for about 10 years now, the presentations become increasingly more spatial over time. And the first time I went, I was looking for any presentation that had a map in it. I was excited to see that, and now most of them all do. And so we're really just getting to know this place in some ways. We're just getting the first really good picture down on paper in some ways. So it makes it hard to really analyze change. You need to do that in smaller areas than this big broad one, where studies have happened consistently and purposefully in order to measure that. And I think that's a lot of what kind of John was talking about, but at this scale, it's very hard to do.
Thank you. Let me just put it another way. So if the person responsible for mapping the hydro distribution, for example, you ask them, what are the 3 big questions you have right now that you'd really like to know the answer to in terms of the distribution, the gaps in the data, where there's something looks like it's changing, but we really can't put our finger on it. Is there some way that, is there somewhere that kind of insight, which is you've got an enormous amount of it's going to be buried in here, can emerge, or
it's not. I would say there's no straightforward synopsis of that in the atlas. There's not a certain section it always appears in, or a table that summarizes it. You would find that in the individual species descriptions and whether the author of that description talked about how that species is changing. So we do it, we do talk about those changes, but I can't tell you that it's been, so we didn't set out as that being one of our objectives that we made sure to always cover. There's a lot undone here in terms of data gaps. And while I said this represents a lot about what we do know, there's a lot that we don't know. This probably makes it also appear in some ways we know more than we do, and you have to be careful about that. So there could be a whole other closely related project that takes the time to tell you what those are. That's something that we talk about frequently, but so far haven't really taken the time or necessarily had the funding to step into, but I think it's really important. Other questions?
Jim got me going now. This just picks up on what Jim was saying. And just, have you contemplated bringing together your authors and those individuals or representatives of the agencies that did the peer review on this production, bringing them all together in one place for, say a couple of 3-day period to go over the results and then go through an exercise along the line of what Jim has talked about?
I haven't, but I really like that idea. I think that's a very good suggestion.
One more question for you, and then a question for John. So you mentioned you were sort of shopping for money for the Boreal Forest Ecological Atlas. I'm just curious, roughly, what does something like that cost? Do you have any ballpark idea of? Yes.
I do. So we have 2 other atlases, ecological atlases. One for Southeast Alaska, that's very much like this one. One for the Western Arctic, that's a lot more simple. So the Southeast Alaska one and the Arctic Ocean one are closer to what we're talking about for the Boreal. Southeast one cost maybe $300,000 or $400,000, and this one cost $1.2 million to put together. So Boreal, I think, would be maybe a little closer to the Southeast Alaska version. Maybe it might be about a $500,000 project, probably a few full-time staff for a couple of years and a couple contractors kind of thing.
And then for John, I just would like to confirm that I think I heard you say that 1/2 of all of the runoff into the Gulf of Alaska is from glaciers. Did I hear you say that?
I think it said nearly half into the Gulf of Alaska was freshwater runoff from glaciers.
Okay.
Then I just pulled that straight out of that report summary.
And does that report talk about how that has changed? Is it sort of a measurement of, you know, an indirect measurement of how quickly the glaciers are accelerating in terms of their melt? And yes.
Right, and then what I didn't present on is Shad's whole effort to quantify mass balance change for glaciers throughout Alaska. So there's also reports on that on our website too, about that change and implications of that change for water runoff into the marine ecosystem.
And tying it to fisheries in the Gulf of.
Yep, and that's what Yumi Armitsu's role at our science center is to tie that directly to fisheries. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Anyone else?
John, don't sit down. Does anyone else have questions in the commission? Okay.
I have a question for John. John, you gave us an overview of the work that the USGS does in the Alaska Science Center. But the USGS as a nationwide entity, there's Arctic, even in Alaska, research done by USGS scientists all over the country. So I get confused sometimes. Lisa Robbins in Florida is looking at ocean acidification in the Arctic.
Yep.
Plenty of people in Reston doing work. Gary Clow at Boulder doing work. Is there any kind of coordination on Arctic research by the USGS across all these various centers?
There's a little bit. So we have a portal, we call it the Science Portal on our webpage. So it has a map of Alaska and it shows where all the projects that are going on in Alaska right now are taking place and who's responsible for those. So we ask USGS researchers outside of the state to log into the portal and put in their information so that we can capture that on that state map. And then we encourage cooperation and people to stop by our center and let us know what they're working on. So, but just in the recent past, we've been coming more and more closely tied to the work done in Santa Cruz by USGS Coastal Marine Geology on that erosion map, because they didn't understand the link to the ecosystem changes that we were seeing and how valuable their data is to what we're trying to predict going forward for wildlife populations. So that link has just really strengthened in the last couple of years as we realize sort of the data that each other have and the power of integrating that information. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity there, but often some disconnect too. So the energy resource assessments done by Dave Hausnecht is another one out of Reston that I'm trying to work more with Dave on, because we have all these really valuable layers in USGS on the same landscape that could really be really powerful when we integrate those data.
But there's no guidance from the top, right? In terms of, okay, we're going to do stuff in the Arctic, so Florida does this and Woods Hole does this. Is there any method to this? It seems almost like ad hoc entrepreneurial in terms of the approach, who does what.
It's really our regional director's office here in Alaska and Anchorage is trying to do that effort, and I'm doing some of that as well, just to try to understand what everyone's doing and how to pull it all together. Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
Other questions?
I've got a couple questions for John.
Okay. So with respect to the caribou research that you mentioned, there was no change in terms of, you talked about the green up and the results that were found. Did that report cover mosquito relief areas and their use and timing, as well as icing events? Do you know?
No, so that was just based on habitat plots on the ground, so no animal work. There was some captive animal work done at UAF to look at changes in forage and how captive animals would respond to those changes. But all that paper was strictly on habitat plots that Fish and Game started in the 1970s.
Okay.
And then we revisited those 2011 to 2014, I believe.
Okay. And
to understand change over time.
okay. And do you know if that's being looked at all otherwise?
Right. So that's the focus of Heather Johnson now at our center.
Okay.
So she has a number of weather stations across the Central Arctic caribou herd range to understand wind and temperature patterns in relation to caribou movements.
Okay.
And in partnership with Alaska Department of Fish and Game, we have a very active collaring program they use to help do their photo assessments to count the animals every year. We're using those to understand how caribou are making decisions about when to move to the far north, when the weather's not so great for standing still, dealing with bugs and that sort of thing.
Okay.
And that's the same data that we'll be using to look at habituation to design features within Prudhoe Bay, and also look for places like bottlenecks, where animals might be having a hard time getting through, or where areas that are easy to get through, and then going on the ground and looking at what design features are there to potentially make recommendations for industry in the future. But a lot of the industry, I think, in Prudhoe Bay is pretty old, and those design features aren't really being used anymore anyway. So we'll just see how that progresses. But
okay.
that's kind of the general plan.
And then I've got a few more questions about they all kind of have to do with who you guys are working with. And you had mentioned the North Slope coast mapping that's being done and the possibility of it being expanded to the west coast of Alaska.
Right.
Are you guys working with Shore Zone at all on that? Is that part of? Does that data feed in?
I don't remember. I can ask. That's Coastal Marine Geology folks in Santa Cruz.
Okay.
But I sent them this presentation yesterday, and they sent me the map of phase 2 and phase 3 around the coast. So I didn't get a chance to put that in this talk.
Okay.
Since I'd already seen the slides, but I could find out. But it's a number of data sets and collaborators that are part of that Western Alaska mapping project.
Okay, great. I'm happy to hear that it's expanding and
yeah, I can see that.
Western Alaska.
It's a nice image showing where all the efforts are and the different data types coming in.
All right, cool. And along those lines, for your algal testing, are you guys interacting with the AHAB folks, the Harmful Algal Bloom Network? Yeah, the AOS run.
So Sarah Shane is now part of that AOS group. So there's a meeting, I think, coming up.
Yeah, yep.
She's going to be part of.
Excellent.
Yep, and
Okay,
they're
great.
doing a poster at AMSS
Okay.
about the new findings and the new capabilities we have in our lab and who we're working with.
All right, awesome. And then finally, you mentioned the toxo work in looking at a bunch of different animals and toxoplasmosis. Are you guys linking in with CDC or anybody else for human-related exposure data?
We just had a meeting 2 weeks ago with ANTHC, CDC, and State of Alaska Veterinarian Bob Gerlach to talk about opportunities for making sure they're aware of the data and what we're doing.
Okay, you might want to loop in the North Slope Borough as well.
Yep.
Great, awesome, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Does anyone else have any other questions for any of the presenters?
Not a question, but I did want to recognize that Nick Fisher is with us. Has been a commission and an advisor and a longtime Arctic expert who has not only added value to this commission, but to everybody else. So thank you very much for joining us, Vic. I appreciate it. And if there aren't any other questions, I want to thank our panelists from this session for your excellent presentations. So we are scheduled for a break, but before we take the break, seeing that we have 10 minutes, I just wanted to extend the opportunity to members of the audience. If any of you have anything that you would like to either share with the commission or ask the commission or ask any of the presenters, I'll just take a 10-minute pause here and see if there's anyone who wishes to say anything, share anything. Vic Fisher.
I would just like to thank the commission, individual members, the chair, the staff, and especially the scientists. 40, 50 years ago, I was a University of Alaska research director. And I'm just flabbergasted by the comparison of where you are today and what's going on compared to what we had to work with. I mean, we just didn't have the resources, we didn't have the knowledge, we didn't have the sponsorships. And I just want to congratulate all of you, all the unseen people here. It's just phenomenal, the progress that we have, the knowledge that's been brought together and what's in process. Anyway, thank you. It's a delight to be here.
Building on the shoulders of those who came before us. Thank you, Vic. Anyone else? Okay, if not,